Hello. Hi. How are you? Good morning. Happy New Year, everybody. Well, it's here. We're going to celebrate a little bit. I don't know if happy days are here again yet, but it's definitely a new year. Let's hope for the best. We've got Laura Belin from Bleeding Heartland to join us here with some news. You may have seen my post on Facebook. Steve King has left the building. Hopefully, we've got him out of there for good this time. I'm hoping that's the case anyway. We're going to talk a little bit about him. He really made Iowa famous in a lot of respects in a way that nobody ever wants to be famous, in Northwest Iowa in particular. But that's coming up. The first thing I wanted to do here was update a story that's kind of breaking. And let's see if I can get this up on the screen here. And update that. It has to do with the National Defense Authorization Act and the $2,000 stimulus checks that a lot of people are following because they desperately need that money. But here's the headline this morning out of Common Dreams. After the GOP repeatedly blocked vote on the $2,000 checks, 41 Democrats joined McConnell to advance a $740 billion Pentagon bill. Quote, the sheer scale of Wednesday's Democratic surrender was truly a sight to behold, and it probably ended the chance for more immediate aid to millions of Americans facing eviction, starvation, and bankruptcy. Now, this reads, after Senate Republicans repeatedly stymied a Senator Bernie Sanders-led effort to force a cleanup or down vote on 2,000 direct payments, dozens of Democrats late yesterday joined Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in allowing the chamber to move ahead with the process of overriding President Donald Trump's veto of the $740 billion National Defense Authorization Act. I got to tell you, folks, I'm not an in-the-weeds kind of guy. These procedural process vote things in Congress, I follow a little bit, but everybody's following this closely, or most people are, because of this thing about the $2,000 payments. The vote on the motion to proceed to the NDAA veto override came after Sanders, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and others denied McConnell unanimous consent this week to speedily advance the behemoth military spending bill, a tactic aimed at securing a clean vote on House-passed legislation that would deliver $2,000 payments to most Americans. But McConnell, joined by Senators Pat Toomey and John Cornyn of Texas, rejected demands for a vote on the direct payments once again on Wednesday, declaring that the checks would benefit millionaires and billionaires. Did you know that, folks? If you're waiting for that $2,000 check, you're a millionaire, you're a billionaire. A complaint that was both false and shamelessly hypocritical, given that the same Republicans had no issue with passing President Donald Trump's $1.5 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthy in 2017. Or, as you've heard me say on this podcast before and heard me bitch loudly, the CARES Act, the $5 trillion that went to those folks. You've joined that club, by the way, if you know that. If you're waiting for that $2,000 check, you're amongst them. Thanks to the delay tactics that Sanders spearheaded, McConnell was forced to hold a vote Wednesday on a formal motion to proceed to the NDAA, so he got that much done. But ultimately, Sanders was one of just six members of the Senate Democratic caucus to vote against the motion, which succeeded by an overwhelming margin of 80-12. Okay, so that's enough of that. I mean, that depresses me enough that I don't want to read it anyway. And you've heard me say on the podcast before, folks, that the land of the free, home of the brave, amber waves of grain and all that kind of. Now, what we really are, we are the military industrial complex. It is the most significant part of our economy. It is what the United States is all about on the world stage. And if there's one thing that's going to get voted up, that's going to get approved, it's the authorization, the funding for our Defense Department. And it just happened again. Bernie knew that. That's why he wanted to use that as leverage to try to stop that. Trump knew that, as a matter of fact. I mean, that's what he was doing as well. Dumb as Trump is, he knows that that's the one thing that's out there that you can use to leverage. And it looks like that's all gone. Well, anyway, I don't want to get depressed because this is supposed to be a Happy New Year thing. I mean, I kind of tongue-in-cheek got a hold of Laura Belin and said, we got to celebrate a little bit because we got Steve King out of the house. Looks like he's literally like Elvis going to be out of the house here very shortly. The swearing in is January 3rd. He hasn't been there anyway. He isn't doing anything. Let's let's get current. Let's get updated on that and
Can
say
I
hi to
say,
Laura
George,
Belin.
a few things about the defense authorization
Yeah.
bill? Because, I mean, as you and I remember, I mean, Republicans have been calling Democrats weak on defense for decades.
Yes.
It hasn't been true. The overwhelming majority of congressional Democrats have always voted for these big military spending bills. And I mean, one example is Dave Loebsack, who's retiring now after 14 years. But when he ran for Congress initially, he was running on his opposition to the Iraq War, among other issues. And then when he got in there, he got seated on the House Armed Services Committee, and he's voted for every military budget. I mean, he voted for especially once the Quad Cities area was added to his district after 2010, he really went to bat for the Rock Island Arsenal, and that just became a major focus of his work. And so it's just something we see. There aren't very many Democrats who want to roll the dice on being accused of voting against funding for our troops. That's the way it's always spun. And so that was why, I respect what Bernie Sanders tried to accomplish this week, but it was always going to be hard to get the caucus to hold together on that kind of hardball.
Well, you ain't telling me anything. That Lobasak situation that you cite is interesting because where do you come down on this? How much of this is third rail politics? The fact that you can't go against because just of the jingoistic nationalism in the country, you can't do anything that would be even perceived as slightly undermining the military. That's part of it. The other part of it, that's the third rail politics part of it. The other part of it's economic, where a lot of these politicians have big military bases and big military manufacturers in their home state. Now, you mentioned the Rock Island Arsenal. I don't think that's a big part of Iowa's economy. So that's probably not the
Loebsack perceived it as a major employer in his district. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Iowa doesn't have as much of the military. Obviously, we don't have a lot of military bases compared to other states, and we don't have as much of the defense contractor business as some other states as well. So, I mean, that's one reason why Chuck Grassley made a name for himself in the 1980s when he was first in the Senate attacking waste in the military budget. And he voted against some defense programs at that time. I mean, he hasn't been singing that tune for quite a while, but that's something that, because Iowa is, relatively speaking, less dependent on the defense industry. But I do think that a lot of the military programs, that they are basically like very inefficient job production programs. I mean, we'd be better off trying to stimulate the economy in other ways besides buying some of these weapon systems that we don't need, or aircraft that the military doesn't even want, just to keep people employed in certain key members' districts. But I do think that Iowans, people perceive that Dave Loebsack represented a heavily Democratic district because Iowa City was part of his district, but really it's not as heavily Democratic as people think. I mean, it's definitely not a safe Democratic district like the one that AOC represents in New York City, or, there are dozens of very safe Democratic House districts, and Iowa doesn't have anything like that. So I think Loebsack was protecting himself a little bit politically, but I also think that it's an economic imperative that drives people to support some of this defense spending.
Loebsack isn't alone. I mean, it's not only the kind of the philosophical thing here, it's the huge amounts of money. We're talking $740 billion for this on paper. Matthew Ho's been on the podcast before. He says, when you factor in a lot of other things, it's $1 trillion really is what we're talking about. It's ever increasing. It's increased exponentially. I bitch about the fact that they had that little bitty 10% reduction bill in the House, and our representatives, our Democrats, all voted against that to even reduce it by a miserly 10%. It's just an insult to injury. But if you're going to be involved in 7 wars around the globe, if you're going to maintain 1,000, some people 700 to 1,000, I've heard, military bases around the world, our next closest competitor has like a few. Jesus.
Right.
I mean, you got to spend this kind of money. And I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean,
and people don't realize how big the military budget is, because we talk about it. One thing I remember from the way back 10 years ago, when the Democrats were trying to pass the healthcare reform, the Affordable Care Act, that the media, whenever there's a big domestic spending program, they tend to describe the price tag as what it's going to cost over 10 years. So that was a $1.7 trillion healthcare plan or something. And yet the defense budget, which is like $600 or $700 billion a year, they don't describe that as like the $6 trillion or the $7 trillion military, but they only talk about the spending for this year on that. So they'll say, the $740 billion defense budget. Well, that's not, it's not comparing apples to oranges. If people realized how much we're spending on the military compared to some other programs, I think they'd be surprised.
I'm really hopeful that Lee Camp's going to be able to come on my show. He wants to, if I can get him scheduled. He's got a new book out this past year that was outstanding. And one of the things that he points out, and I'm sure that you're aware of this, Rand Powell and some of these other people for years have been wanting to get the Defense Department audited. It was never possible. They finally got one audited. I think it was a combined audit with HUD and the Defense Department. $21 trillion, folks, was unaccounted for. They couldn't come up with it. They didn't know where it went. $21 trillion. My God, it's an amount of money that you really cannot, I mean, unless you've got a supercomputer, you can't even figure out how much money that is. But that's how much money was off the books, lost. The audit was a massive fail, the first and only one. $21 trillion. God, I hope to get him on. But okay, so let's talk about this Steve King guy, because he's the guy. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good riddance. I mean, look, the guy to serve 18 years of Congress and go out the way he did is very humiliating. I mean, losing his own party's primary. And I think we always have to remember that J.D. Scholten, who ran against Steve King in 2018, is more than anybody else responsible for what happened this year in Iowa politics, because Iowa Republicans, Steve King has always been the same person. He has always said horribly bigoted, racist things, and he has called attention to himself in a negative way for more than a decade. And Republicans were always behind him. Terry Branstad cut an ad for him in his 2012 campaign against Christy Vilsack. Governor Reynolds was a co-chair of his campaign in 2018. And nobody, Joni Ernst endorsed him when he had a primary challenger in 2016. I mean, nobody has ever really stood up to Steve King until J.D. Scholten showed that maybe this guy could be beaten. And J.D. came within about 3.5 points of beating him in 2018. And that was the point where the Republican establishment said, we got to get rid of this guy. And so Randy Feenstra, who's the new representative-elect from the 4th District, he's really no better on any of the substantive issues. He's less of a loudmouth about, he's certainly less he doesn't go to Europe and meet with white supremacist, right-wing parties, but he otherwise, he really shares a lot of the same politics as Steve King. But the Republican establishment got behind him very early in 2019 because they said, this district is potentially at risk if we keep nominating this toxic guy. But without JD doing so well in the 2018 election, I don't think that we would have seen any change.
You mentioned J.D. Scholten. So talk about him now in 2020. And we talked about this briefly once before, kind of the good news, bad news scenario. The good news was he actually outpolled Biden in that district up there in Northwest Iowa, gave hope to some progressives that maybe these kind of politics might be able to make inroads out there. Maybe that it's undiscovered country, that those folks might be a real factor at the ballot box. But you were kind of lukewarm to that analysis, as I recall.
I mean, look, I'm a big fan of JD, so I don't want to disparage anything that he accomplished. But I think that that part of Iowa is just very heavily conservative. And it is, I ran the numbers of the 2016 and the 2020 elections. And there's a way to measure partisanship of a state or a congressional district using something called the Partisan Voting Index. And it tells you basically how much a group of people votes either more Republican or more Democratic than the United States as a whole. So Iowa as a whole, if you look at the last 2 presidential elections, we're at about R+6, which means that we vote about 6 points more Republican than the nation as a whole. But the 4th district part of Iowa is R+16. Okay, so that is just very, very difficult. I mean, there aren't any Democrats in Congress representing a district that is R+16. And there aren't any Republicans representing a district that's more than D+, maybe, 2 or 3 or 4. I mean, it's just very difficult to overcome that kind of partisanship. So JD did, I think it was 36 of the 39 counties where he got more votes than Joe Biden. So he definitely did well. It wasn't as well. I think people had higher hopes because in 2018, he did so much better than Fred Hubble did in the governor's race. But I think that what we saw this year was quite a lot of that was a function of running against Steve King. So there definitely were some moderate Republicans or maybe Republican leaning independents who just didn't want to pull the lever for Steve King. But when they have a guy like Randy Feenstra, who just hasn't embarrassed the state in the same way, they will vote for the Republican. So I think that's just what JD was up against. And so I'm not, I think he ran a great campaign. I mean, he raised almost $3 million and he visited in 2018 race. He did at least 3 campaign events in all of the 39 counties. Most of them, he did more than 3 events. This race, he did campaign events in every town, even the tiniest town, almost 400 little towns in those 39 counties. He had an event. And especially when you consider how hard it was to campaign in person this year with the pandemic. I mean, he got most of that accomplished in 2019. So really, he ran a phenomenal campaign. It's just that it's very difficult to overcome that kind of partisanship. I'm still more surprised that Steve King lost the primary than anything else, because I thought that he would have built up enough support among that Republican base that he would have been able to survive the primary challenge. But it was just too much. There was a lot of money spent against him, and he just didn't run a good campaign in his own defense.
Well, okay, so let's say he hadn't lost the primary.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say King had won.
Right.
Would he have won the election again?
I think it would have been very close. I mean, I think given what we saw with the vote for Trump, it was pretty tough. I mean, Trump got well over 60% in that 4th district. And so I think that probably he would have been able to pull Steve King over the line. I mean, we'll never know. It definitely would have been a very competitive race. It would have been a race that attracted a lot more outside spending. I mean, but we saw Trump really saved a lot of Republicans this year. And I was just looking at it in some of the Iowa House races last night for working on something about this Southeast Iowa special state Senate election that's coming up next month. And I mean, there was a district down there where Trump won with over 60% of the vote, and the Republican candidate for the Iowa House got like 50.5%. You know, he just barely, it was just enough of coattails to help him out. And I think that would have been difficult for JD, but it would have been a very different campaign, because during the fall, there would have been a lot more outside groups spending money against Steve King. Whereas what we saw this year was a lot of groups, Republican groups, conservative groups like the Chamber of Commerce, they spent money against Steve King in the primary. And then after Randy Feenstra won that primary, basically there was no more outside spending in the 4th district. It was just, you know, everybody kind of wrote off that race.
Well, Northwest Iowa is a perfect example of rural republicanism across America. And I think I heard your dog. There he goes. Hopefully that's all right. That's okay. But, you know, it's a perfect example of what I call the unholy trinity of the Republican Party. It's really prevalent up there in Northwest Iowa. Folks, if you haven't been up there, I mean, you ought to, number one thing, when you go up there and drive around a little bit, you're going to be struck by these massive farm fields. I grew up in Iowa, folks, but if you're used to the southern half of Iowa, you ain't seen nothing like what they've got up there. I mean, they've got farm fields that stretch from horizon to horizon up there. So that unholy trinity that I talk about, it's anti-tax, it's anti-abortion, and anti-gun control. And of course, first and foremost with those folks up there, taxes. I mean, they've got land like you've never seen before. And then, of course, you've got that red herring in American politics and in farm country, which is that death tax that they keep talking about, which is bogus and
total hoax.
Yes.
I mean, the death tax is the biggest hoax. They can't find one farm. I mean, sometimes when somebody dies, people sell the farm, but that's because one of the children wants to cash in and the other children can't afford to buy them out. That's why the farm gets sold after somebody dies, not because of any inheritance tax. It's ridiculous. But I wanted to say, you mentioned anti-abortion, and that was a key thing for Randy Feenstra in that primary up there. The National Right to Life and a couple of other groups, anti-abortion groups, got behind him in that primary. And that must have been very painful for Steve King to see, because he did make a name for himself in the House as being one of the most uncompromising anti-abortion votes. I mean, he generally didn't want to vote for bills that made any exceptions for rape or incest, for instance. And so I think that King would have not expected that key members of that community, the anti-choice community, would have gotten behind a Republican primary opponent. And it just shows you that they realize that Steve King, long term, he's a loser, and they just don't want to have that baggage if they can avoid it.
He's a loser in more ways than one. I mean, validated by the fact that he's packing up and moving out. I suppose his office is empty already. My God, let's hope so. I'm okay. So I mentioned the anti-tax part of it, the anti-abortion part of it. That's the other thing that'll strike you when you go up into that part of the country. I mean, people, again, in the southern half of the state might be knowledgeable about Pella as an example and the Dutch influence there. When you go up into Northwest Iowa, there's this Dutch reformist church, whatever it is. I mean, man, it's religious up there. That country, that anti-abortion thing is huge up there. And then I mentioned the anti-gun, which is always kind of the third leg of this anti-gun control, the third leg of this unholy trinity, as I call it. But why would Northwest Iowa be anti-gun control? Well, I think of it this way. It's kind of like the ultimate don't treat on me type thing. They don't want anybody telling them what to do at all. They've got it made, man. That land was handed down by their forefathers. They've got control of it. It's probably been incorporated now. I mean, that stuff's all in corporations and all that, but still, they got it. They want to keep it. And that's what the taxes thing is all about. And they don't want anybody telling them what to do. And really, that's got a lot to do with the anti-gun control movement. They don't want anybody telling them what to do with their guns. And that's a huge element up there in Northwest Iowa. And how that gets overturned, again, like you said, plus 16, man, there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah. And I mean, the anti-tax thing, I mean, it's sort of comical because if you talk to a lot of Iowa conservatives, they're against government handouts or whatever. Well, look at all of the bailouts. I mean, the regular subsidies that already go to agriculture, and then huge bailouts that were designed to compensate farmers hurt by Trump's trade war with China, where they lost export markets. I mean, there just was such a huge amount of government money. And yet when you talk about other spending programs, they view that as like their money going to, other people. And I think that there's definitely a thread of racism that runs through that there's a perception that the government programs like food assistance go to a lot of people who aren't white. I mean, in Iowa, the majority of people on Medicaid are white, but there's a perception that, I don't want my money going to lazy people, especially dark-skinned people. And that is just something that, that's going to be difficult to overcome. It's a very widespread view, not only in Northwest Iowa, but it tends to be most concentrated. I mean, there are some counties up in the far northwest corner of the state where Republicans get more than 80% of the vote.
I talk about being older on the podcast. I mean, I've got a lot more in the wagon than I got out in front of the horse, folks. In my lifetime, there's three categories that I can think of that it is really unbelievable to me. And one of them, maybe first and foremost, is the economic wealth, the growth of the Iowa farmer. When I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. I knew farmers. It was nothing like it is. They have gotten so wealthy. They are doing so well. Everybody's concerned about the financial plight of farmers. Now, it's different in different parts of the state. There are pockets of farmers that are poor. But I mean, just look at the highways and the trucks going to the grain elevators in the fall, the yields that they're getting, the prices that are similar to what they were when I was a kid. My God, these big brand new freight liners and aluminum trailers just to haul the grain to the elevators. It's just amazing to me. The other thing that I see on every street corner now, banks. My God, what are all these banks? Well, banking deregulation and all the assistance that we've given to banks. And the other thing is churches. I mean, that's the other thing. All churches on every street corner. Mike, what is it with the proliferation, of churches in this state? But those are the three things that are most visible to me. And that's not talking about the insurance industry and the capitals and my God, the pyramids that they've built and that type of thing. But anybody that's concerned about the financial plight of Iowans, I think, is overstating the cause. It's just mind-boggling to me. Well, I wanted to talk about King. Obviously, everybody's well aware of his stupidity and the things that he said and the racial remarks and the embarrassment that he's caused to the state of Iowa. But in talking with you, Laura, this Feenstra guy, hasn't
Yeah.
exactly hit the ground running. You've already had an encounter with him that's really eye-opening. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this was, I spend a lot of time covering the state legislature. And so I often reach out to the Republican lawmakers for comment. Some of them never respond to me, and some of them occasionally respond to me. But in the late 3 years ago, so late 2017, everyone knew that Governor Reynolds was going to be pushing for big tax cuts. And I got a tip about a plan that Randy Feenstra, who was the chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, that's the tax writing committee, that he had circulated this plan to his Republican colleagues. So I wrote a piece about this tax plan, which was like the working draft at the time of December 2017, and I reached out to him for comment. And I had never really had any interaction with him before. And he wrote back to me saying, not sure who the author is on this one, so I'm not sure who put this together. Thanks for sharing. I need to find out if this member is running rogue over the plan. Well, I mean, I had the email that he had sent. He had just sent the email to his colleagues like a week earlier saying, I wanted to share this with you, and this is my idea of a tax plan. And like the document that was attached, it was a Microsoft Word document. And you can go into Microsoft Office and you can see the last person who edited or altered a document. And it was Randy Feenstra himself. So, I mean, it was just like an easily disprovable lie. I mean, I've been lied to before by politicians, and certainly I've been ignored by a lot of politicians, but for someone to just brazenly lie in a way that was just going to be easy for me to demonstrate that it was a lie, I mean, I was surprised by that, honestly. I would have been less surprised if he just had ignored all of my messages about it. And so that was one reason I really didn't think that Steve King was in danger, because I just felt like Randy Feenstra was such an amateur. And he never ran a tough campaign. He had never had an opponent in a primary or a general election. I mean, he'd been serving in the Senate for about the state Senate for about 10 years, but he'd never had to compete in a real election before. So I thought, King is going to wipe the floor with this guy. But as it turned out, I mean, Feenstra had a lot of money behind him. King didn't raise a lot of money, and it was enough for Feenstra to just, sort of be there as the conservative establishment guy. But I think the Congressional Hill reporters are going to have a lot of fun with this guy. I mean, he's just not, to me, it just is not really ready for prime time. And we'll see. I mean, he came out this week and he said we need to do something about the monopolistic the meat packing. We need to have some kind of antitrust thing and break up the monopolies and meat packing. I mean, this is interesting because J.D. Scholten has been talking about that issue for years. It's not an issue that Randy Feenstra was ever working on when he was in the state legislature that I'm aware of. So he just kind of seems to be like pandering without much of a clue of what he's doing. So we'll see what comes out of this. But I think he won't be a national figure of embarrassment the way Steve King was. But I do think that he's someone we're going to have to keep an eye on. And I don't take anything that he says for granted without checking it out. I mean, I would just encourage every reporter covering Randy Feenstra to fact check absolutely everything.
Well, maybe he suffers from what I call LCS, the lying, cheating, and stealing syndrome. I hope not. Let's just hope it's lying at this point. But my God, when you lie to reporters, I look at that and I think the insult to the injury there is, dude, you're running in Northwest Iowa. You got that plus 16 that Laura talked about. They just voted for Trump, elected him in 2016. What are you lying about? I mean, you don't need to lie to be able to succeed up there. And it just, God, it's American politics. I don't know.
Well, I mean, all he had to say was something like, "Well, it's the plan, the tax plan. It's a work in progress, and we haven't finalized yet," or something. Just say, give me some comment like that. Well, that's not the final bill. As it turned out, the bill that they passed was somewhat different from that original proposal. But I mean, just to claim that he had no idea where it came from when he should have known that since I was asking about it, there was a good chance I already knew that he had circulated it to his colleagues, because otherwise, how would I be asking about it? So anyway, it was just, it was kind of amusing. But that's my
wrap it up today.
You never get a second chance to make a first impression. So that was
start right off the mark with a lie. Well, again, we got to take it out of here. I got to get going. I don't suppose that Steve King's going to be watching podcasts by George, but if you're a Steve King supporter, here we go.
Yeah.
That's
I
my
mean,
happy New Year prop for Steve King. I don't know, because he's going to be gone, out of sight, out of mind. Is there one thing about Steve King that, he made all those crazy remarks on a policy level, Laura? He didn't do a lot of policy. So
no,
I don't know.
he
How do you
didn't.
come down on him and his legacy, if there is such a thing?
He didn't. I mean, he claims that he got a lot of amendments passed or got a lot of amendments killed. I would say his biggest achievement, honestly, was he was one of the, and I don't consider it something to be proud of, but he would be proud of it. In 2013, there was this bipartisan immigration bill that passed the Senate with more than 65 votes. And there was a lot of pressure to bring it to the floor of the House. And there were a lot of House Republicans that would have voted for it. This would have created a path to legal residence for the Dreamers. And it had a lot of good things in there. I mean, it wasn't as far as I would go, but it was a good bill. And King and a group of wacko right-wing House Republicans really pressured that Speaker John Boehner to keep that off the House floor and made sure it never came up for a vote. If it had come up for a vote, it would have passed, and that would have been a great thing for the country. So, I mean, I think that Steve King, although he didn't champion a lot of legislation that was signed into law, he can point to victories like that, I don't consider it a victory, but he would. And I'm not sure, by the way, that we've heard the last from him, because he may become a regular on some right-wing TV show or radio program. Yeah. He may even get his own radio program. I don't know. So I think we may be hearing from him, but I just feel like the way he went out, I mean, he lost a primary in a humiliating way. He then, barely showed up for work the last few months. I mean, no one likes losing an election, right? But Abby Finkenauer, she lost her re-election bid, and she kept coming to work and voting on the important bills that the House was considering. And King just basically stopped showing up. So it's just not, I don't think that he can look back with great pride on anything he accomplished for Iowans.
He'll probably dive headfirst into the swamp. He'll probably go to work for some, Heritage Foundation think tank or something like that. I don't know what it would be.
Yeah.
You got to be in a dunk tank. It reminds me of a story from my youth. Not a story. I actually saw this. Had a bunch of buddies. We went to a county fair, and they had a state trooper that arrested some friends of mine, and he was in a dunk tank. Good idea to raise money, probably for a charity. But this one guy got the 3 baseballs. I think he bought like 10 of them. I can't remember. And instead of trying to hit the little arm on the side of the dunk tank, he stood there and threw them right at this guy's head in the cage and about knocked the wire off. And the guy had to jump down in the water to avoid being hit by the baseballs. And that's what I'd like to do to Steve King. I'd like to get him in a dunk tank and throw some baseballs at him. But he's done. He's out of there.
Well,
and it's
hopefully Biden's Treasury Secretary will get Harriet Tubman on that $20 bill sooner rather than later.
Wouldn't that be something? So,
yeah, that would make Steve King very angry.
Yeah, it would. He was
I mean, honestly, that's the kind of thing. I mean, how can you? Why? Why, Steve King? Why would you be upset about Harriet Tubman being on the $20 bill? I mean, that's just the kind of thing that was unnecessary. Randy Feenstra is probably not going to go out on a limb on stuff like that.
God, he's just a nut. I wrote down some of these things that he did. And if you recall, this anti-Islamic Dutch politician, Geert Wilders, he endorsed Wilders in 2017. A guy from the northwestern part of Iowa, U.S. representatives, endorses this Dutch politician. And he tweeted, Wilders understands that culture and demographics are our destiny. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies. I always talk about, are they too dumb or are they in on it on this podcast, Laura? I think this guy might be too nuts. I mean, that's crazy train stuff.
No, I mean, he's deeply racist. He's not just using, there are Republican politicians who use racism for political gain, but he is a true believer in that. And that's somebody else's babies. I remember that was just such a huge horrible. I had a couple of guest authors who were compelled to write about that on my site. I mean, it really is a horrible thing to say. And actually, Steve King represents some very diverse counties. Some of the counties with the highest proportion of Latino residents in Iowa are in that northwest part of the state.
Because of the plants.
So Crawford County, Buena Vista County. And so it's just a horrible thing to say. Also, most Iowans unless you're Native American. I mean, most Iowans come from immigrants. My grandparents, all four of my grandparents were born overseas, and one of my grandfathers came to this country as an unaccompanied minor. He came with his two siblings who were unaccompanied minors. So, I mean, it's just disgusting to point to today's immigrants that way as a threat to our culture. And it's just not something that any politician should do. No public figure should be pushing those racist buttons.
We're going to wrap it up. I'm going to encourage everybody to go to bleedingheartland.com. I always do. Check out the plethora of information there, the great stories, the contributors that Laura has on the website. It's a community blog. Of course, you can become a patron on patreon.com. It doesn't take much. I mean, little $5 a month, something like that. If everybody does that, it goes a long way towards allowing her to continue to do this great work that I'm looking forward to in 2020. So, put a bow, or 2021. I mean, put a bow on 2020, Laura. Tell us here at year's end what's coming up for Bleeding Heartland and what you're looking forward to in the new year.
Oh, well, I mean, I'll be, of course, continuing to follow this coronavirus pandemic. The legislature is going to be back at work in the middle of January, and that always occupies a lot of my time. The redistricting, we're going to be adopting a new political map based on the 2020 census count. And that's going to be a big thing for me to watch. So, but yeah, I do appreciate the support and from readers who can donate. I'm actually just a state agency right now is trying to overcharge me for some records I've requested. So I'm kind of going back and forth with them, challenging their estimated fee. But that's the kind of thing that the readers support. It does help me with web hosting fees, with records requests, and other operating costs like that. So technical support.
Well, that's great. Thanks for participating. Thanks for being a part of the show here in 2020, looking ahead to the new year here. And want to wish everybody a happy new year. And please go to podcastbygeorge.com and click on a badge. If you're already following us on Facebook, please do that. But you can also get us on YouTube and iTunes and Spotify and all the places where podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And I think that's not all there is for 2020. There ain't no more to this year. Happy days are here again. Let's hope in 2021. That's another podcast.
Happy New Year and healthy New Year to all.
Thank you, Laura Belin. That's another podcast by George. All right. Let's